Okay, welcome everybody. This is the third panel in VisInPractice. This is the panel on bridging academia, industry, and government, not necessarily in that order, right? Hopefully in all combinations. This panel will have a little bit more of a local flavor. We've concentrated 3 out of the 4 are local people, and also the fourth person from Vienna, a place I spent several months in a sabbatical some years ago. Fantastic Viz community. I only ever got to see VR Viz once, but that was really nice. So we've got 4 panelists. I think what I might do is introduce you in order and briefly before you give each of your presentations. All right, so our first presenter is going to be Bill Endress from the Department of English at the University of Oklahoma. And he works, his visualization related work is about doing VR and AR with classical documents and actual like physical books and so on, including imaging of those sorts of things. Yeah. So Bill, please feel free.
Thank you, Chris. Let's see.
Screen share.
Screen share? Ah, there we go. Good afternoon, and thanks for coming. What I work on is early illuminated manuscripts. They're considered insular manuscripts. They were made in the British Isles from about 600 to 900, so they're pretty early. They've had a lot of trauma in their lives. If you think you've had trauma, they've had trauma. They've had Viking invasions, civil wars, natural disasters, all sorts of things. So when I image a page, and this is a page from the St. Chad Gospels made around 730, it spent some time in Wales. The likely thing that happened was the Vikings stole it. It would have had a very decorated cover with jewels and precious metals on it. They ripped the cover off. Somebody found the manuscript, took it to Wales because they knew it was valuable. It was made out of about 350 calf hides. So it was very expensive. And this guy in Wales, he was in some trouble. He was involved in some shady land dealings. So nothing really changes. So he traded his best horse for the manuscript, gave it to the cathedral for the good of his soul. So he got in God's graces again. So here in this manuscript, you can see that it's very difficult to read. So I think of photographs not as photographs, but as digitalizations. And once you have things digital, you can do some wonderful things as far as recoveries are concerned. I use ImageJ, which was developed by the National Health Institute for medical imaging. And it has some wonderful plugins. And here I'm just going to blow this up a little bit so you can see. And the screen does degrade my image a little bit. But I can literally do a decorrelation stretch and stretch collars so that I can see things that I haven't been able to see before. And you can kind of make out, if you were looking on my screen, you see this very well. I can do some minor adjustments here, and you can start to see the letters coming out at the top. So I've been able to read all the pages in the St. Chad Gospels through this technique. Another imaging technique I use, and the main thing I'm trying to really do is, hold off on that one. What I'm trying to do is visualize the complex materiality of manuscripts. Because so little textual information remains, the secrets of that time period are actually residue in the materiality. One thing the monks like to do is scratch with a stylus and no ink. These are beautiful manuscripts. They didn't want to lose that aesthetics, and the aesthetics was praising God. So here, you can probably see a little bit through the dirt. You can see a little bit of writing here. This is a technique. I take a number of images with different angles of lighting. Then I have software that combines them together. Then I can adjust the lighting, and I can start to see better. However, I usually can't see well enough, So let's do a specular enhancement. And I've got that too bright. And suddenly, you can read the names there. So there's all sorts of writing throughout the manuscript. Some are notes about lectures that they would give or sermons they would give. Some are names for oaths. The other thing that I've moved a lot into is 3D visualizations. And here is a manuscript. I was just in England and got back last night. So if you can see, one of the things that I've been really working on is to try to get a good enough 3D model so that you can actually see the rise of pigments. The St. Chad Gospels has layered pigments on it. Also, the ink actually eats its way into the vellum. So you can see here the lines of text going around. Let me show you just one more. And here's 2 pages side by side. Let me make those a little larger so you can see them. And then we can zoom up and get very personal with them. And we still have the sense of the page as a page. If I look at the page, this particular page is done with diffuse lighting. So all of the details, the surface details disappear. When I'm in 3D, let me get that a little brighter. That doesn't get very bright. Suddenly I see the contours of the page and work with all the details. One of the things that I want to do as well is to 3D print this so somebody seeing impaired can actually experience what an illuminated manuscript looks like. So that's the work that I do. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Bill. Our second presenter will be Dave King. Dave King is a co-founder, I believe, of a company called Exaptive. Founder? Okay. Here in Oklahoma City, one of their locations is a couple miles north of here. And Exaptive focuses on bringing, in part, visualization to innovation. Right? So how can you connect data, creativity, and innovation together? And I believe Dave has an interest in, a little bit at least, in the social sciences and the humanities as well, and also software engineering. So please tell us all about it.
Yeah, we actually, while I'm loading up my computer, we actually worked on a project a number of years ago around texts, which were somewhat similar to what Bill was showing. Though it was a cool visualization, we were interested in how to create a landscape. It worked when we tested. Let's try again. Oh, did I? Okay, wait. Well, I'll keep telling this story. So we were working with a professor in the humanities who was studying Islamic hermeneutics, and he looks at texts, and he's interested in how they evolve over time. And so we built a visualization that created a conceptual landscape, but derived inspiration from Google Maps. So some of the same UX characteristics of being able to zoom in and out and explore sort of a rich landscape and get more detail. Oh, good. That was the project that we did. But that's not what I think's the most relevant for this kind of VisInPractice. As Chris was talking about, what I'm interested in is the intersection of technological systems and social systems. So I've worked for 20 years in visualization in one form or another, but what I've become really passionate about and focused my company on is how do you create visualizations that actually lead to new knowledge, not just the representation of the existing knowledge. And to the extent that new knowledge comes from people, not always true. People are working on like AI generating knowledge, but I'm interested in getting new knowledge from people. How can the visualization support ideation and conversation and knowledge generation? How are they a prop between people that are involved in some kind of collective intelligence? And that is kind of a network problem. And so I'm also fascinated with network diagrams, which in a way is a trite subject at this point. But how can you use network diagrams to get beyond just the inevitable hairball? And what happens if you start building networks not from individual data sets, but from individual contributions of people? So this is a network that's being built incrementally based on each one of those people providing some information. I'm going to pause for a second. We've all seen, the reason I picked this example is, in a way, it's not new to any of you that are visual practitioners. We've all seen wiggly network diagrams animated over time. But this is a network diagram that's created from these people individually entering data without the benefit of the visualization to guide them. They're going to see the visualization after the fact, and there's some subtlety around how to do that in a way that doesn't result in too much disconnection or too much hairball over connection. And we can talk about that in the Q&A if you want. Once you have these networks, they become the hairballs pretty quick. There's a lot of tooling that we've sort of learned that we wrap around the visualization to actually make it useful. So, for example, we can adjust layout. That's not particularly new. But what if these visualizations, so this is a layout that has evolved through conversation. And in that conversation, we may find that these three terms over here, tolerance of imperfection, perfectionism, and perfectionist, what if those are really the same thing? And so we're going to merge those together and say, let's just call that perfectionism. And now what was 3 nodes in the network becomes 1. Again, not technically difficult, but interesting because it kind of changes what is the visualization. It's now bidirectional. It's not just a visualization, it's an application. Likewise, once people see something interesting, maybe they have an idea. Now we're going to create a new node in the network. We call it a spark in this case. And that shows up as that little triangle that's illuminated. So what I'm really interested in is what happens when you start to blur these distinctions between visualization and data entry. Over here, we've got Amelia. And so Amelia's starting network was that. This is what she actually entered. So she didn't interact with a visualization. She just answered like 4 questions. She was somewhat surprised that this is the visualization of what she entered. And she was even more surprised when she realized that that small amount of data, not big data, small amount of data actually led to this variety of interconnection with people who had also just created these tiny localized networks. And that led to, in 1 hour, there was a 1-hour course here, or a 1-hour group, that led to these 2 ideas being produced that actually affected how these people went back and did their job afterwards. So happy to talk more about that as we get into the discussion. It gives you a little flavor of what I do. I'll load up this slide for you next. Thank you.
So our third panelist is Kim Clocko-McLean, who's with the National Severe Storms Laboratory at the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, right? Or NSSL at NOAA, thank goodness for acronyms. I actually have known Kim for a long time. She took my visual analytics class at OU many years ago, enough that I can't remember when. And a lot of her work focuses on having visualization be a part of operational user interfaces and also interfaces for informing the public and communicating with them about severe storm events and so on. So I'll let you take it from there.
Thank you. Yeah, kind of a nice segue from the last presentation. I'm also interested in the intersection of physical systems and social. And I work at the National Severe Storms Laboratory in a group called the Behavioral Insights Unit. And in that unit, we are charged with trying to help physical science developers who know a lot about programming, a lot about the atmosphere, and a lot about making all kinds of scientific visualizations. We're trying to help them do so in a way that's actually useful for risk communication and informed decision-making in fulfillment of NOAA's mission for public safety. And so at the lab, one of the things that we work on, I just have on the left side this little plume going through space. We're interested in trying to provide gap-filling severe weather information. If you live in Oklahoma, you know severe weather is a big deal here. It's a big deal in a lot of places. What we have right now with the National Weather Service is what we call a deterministic watch warning advisory system. You get a piece of information at one point in time and then another piece of information at another. Meteorologists know that things are changing under that. They know a lot is evolving, they're watching it, but we're not providing you a lot of that information. With the advancements in supercomputing that we have now, we're able to create things like ensemble systems that are able to generate probabilistic estimates of reasonable futures. And we are seeing all of this ourselves, and we want to find ways to convey that. So one of the things I work on is probabilistic visualizations. This little phi plume is an example of what something like this could look like. So whereas now when you get warned a storm could happen, it's about a lead time of maybe 15 minutes. We could give you something like this that could tell you over the next hour or over the span of several hours what the likelihood is that you could experience severe weather at your location. So as we're developing this, there is another hazard space in the National Weather Service where they have a lot of probabilistic information going out, and we're looking at them and trying to look at the kinds of issues they face, because we also will likely face the same kinds of challenges. And I wanted to offer an example I thought you all could relate to because it's been in the news. It just happened. Hurricane Ian that hit Florida. This hurricane, you can see there's several visualizations I've put up here. And I put them up there in sort of an ugly way. They're a little disjointed. You're not sure what goes with what time period was any of this even from. That's how that information is experienced by our users. We live in a world where information about weather is communicated through multiple channels, multiple sources, and they all use different kinds of visual techniques to render different attributes of the threats. And we leave as though we've taken a book and we've just ripped pages out of it and thrown it at people and said, make a story yourselves. That's kind of what we do when there are things like hurricanes that are possible. We're asking you to take this information and assemble it yourself, rather than creating and fostering visualization techniques that assemble things into meaningful storylines. So what you can see on the left side here are 3 different ways of rendering just the center of the storm, the eye wall, where it could go. What we hate as a field is that people focus on that and they forget the other things that are actually the most important hazards that could affect their lives and ultimately that cause the most fatalities, as that did with Ian. And that is storm surge, the lower right corner image, and perhaps winds in excess of really critical thresholds. For the most part, it's water. It's water from the surge and it's water from the rain that ends up killing people. And we hide that with the cone of uncertainty. That's what everybody sees. They fixate on this one small point. And we're coming to find that with Ian, this was a really big problem. Not only do we have the spatial uncertainty that we're trying to convey in some meaningful way, it's changing over time. And we're coming to find that the emergency management personnel who are responsible for evacuation decisions, they were watching that trend rather than just where the watches and warnings were that the Hurricane Center was putting out at any given moment in time. They were waiting for that next update because they saw a trend, a shift that they thought might spare Fort Myers. And it did not. They were always in, technically, our warnings and our cone, but there's a lot going on here that it is this intersection of the data visualization and decision-making process over time that we're trying to unpack, and we're trying to delve into problems like this so that we can help people make the most reasonable, informed decisions they can without the kinds of decision blindnesses that can be fostered through visualization practice that kind of buries the story. And with that, happy to talk a little bit more through the rest of the panel. Thank you.
And our fourth panelist will be Johanna Schmidt from VRVIS, the Center for Virtual Reality and Visualization Research in Vienna, where she's currently the head of visual analytics, I believe. So Johanna is a longtime member of the visualization community, of course, and if you don't know, the Vienna community for visualization is really tightly connected between academia and industry. So there's the University of Vienna, the Technical University of Vienna, and VRVIS, and I don't even know how many people from those groups are here at Viz. They tend to dominate every year. We'll see if Edie's here or not this year. Sorry, Der Meister. I believe you're mostly working with like time data these days and visual analytics applications and systems, including in industry. So looking forward to hearing more.
I will just switch laptops here. May I hand you that? Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the nice introduction, Chris. HDMI, which is over there. All right, great. So I just have one slide to quickly introduce the field that I'm working on. So the VRVIS is a research center in Vienna. We are located in between university and industry, so very similar to the Fraunhofer concept. So we take results from the universities and make it usable for industry. And I'm the head of the visual analytics group, so we have different research groups at the VRVIS. The main aim for all groups is we do research in visual computing, so we always want to transfer data to images. And in the visual analytics research group, we mainly deal with time-dependent data. So our company partners are from the manufacturing industry and from the energy sector. So they're mainly dealing with IoT data, with process data, and they actually want to better understand their manufacturing processes. And that's quite interesting because that means that we are developing tools actually for engineers, for mechanical engineers, for process engineers who do not really have a background in visualization or in data analytics. So they know the processes very well, they know the machines, they know the production process, but they're not very familiar with statistical analysis, with data analysis, with visualization. And developing tools for these people is very interesting and requires a lot of communication with them, understanding their needs, understanding their tasks. And here you see some results from our tools. So these are the visual analytics platforms they are really working with. And it's also a very great success that they really use our tools to analyze their own data. And then they're coming back with new questions and also with new insights they got. So very, very interesting field to work on. My team, we are currently 6 people, also with some students, some postdoc researchers, PhDs, students, so quite mixed. Yeah, I think these are the main points. Thank you very much.
Q&A. It just seems better than being shoved over there.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not sure how to do this. This is feeling a little bit like Jerry Springer or something like that. Right. I think I'm going to want to sit down at some point, but great. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So we do have a Slido question or two, and I'm sure they'll be coming in, and I'll check that. But this is a more in-person panel than the morning ones are. Please feel free. And I guess what I'll do if you have a question is I'll bring you the microphone. Please use the microphone, otherwise anybody on virtual won't be able to hear you. So we are going to have some more specific questions for you individually, of course, but I'd like to start by asking kind of a big picture question. With respect to your experience in academia or in industry and government and the various kinds of groups of people that you work with, what have been some of the biggest challenges in terms of having visualization somehow carry over to those other groups?
Shall we do a round, probably? Then I will start. So I think for us, there are two main challenges that we are facing. One is limited data and visualization literacy of our users. So they are only used to very simple visualization, basic plotting techniques, and it's very hard to get them used to very complex visualization. So that's the one thing. And the other problem we are facing currently, and which is getting more and more important, is that we are actually not having a visualization or analytics problem, but we are having a data problem. So the companies do not really manage to keep their data in a good quality and keep it at a central location. So in many cases, our visualization projects start out as a visualization project. And then we ask them, okay, where is the data that we should visualize? Oh yeah, it's gathered around 5 different databases, and it's stored in text and in documents and in time series. And we spend a lot of time to get the data into some state where we can actually visualize it. So I think these are the two main challenges we face.
Oh boy. So I'll share two big ones. One, I work for the federal government. And so, yeah, let me tell you about technology transition plans. It's, wow. If we want to change something, the process to do it is so arduous that stops innovation before it ever begins to a very large degree. And another issue is that, you know, we become embedded in public safety infrastructure. So some of that bureaucracy is sensible. But if you've looked at things like that hurricane cone of uncertainty and recognized that not only does most of the public not understand what it means, and it's our marquee product, even some meteorologists don't agree about what it means and how it's generated at the National Hurricane Center. Communication studies have gone in and they just have different things in mind when they're trying to design it. So technically, there's not even a consistent message being conveyed from the center itself, from forecast period to forecast period. You know, like, why are we doing this? But that leads to my second point, which is we create things that are meteorologically or scientifically convenient, things that we can estimate more easily because we have the data, than trying to take a decision science approach and try to create things that are really valuable, that we understand we have consistent definitions for, and are meaningful. And that's just because the agencies and labs are all run by physical scientists and meteorologists and always have been. So when you are a hammer, everything looks like a nail. I'll just create the thing that I can make, and you sort of miss the forest for the trees.
It's interesting to hear the different perspectives. You know, on my side, I run a company and we sell software as a service tools that include visualization to other organizations. Some of those are enterprises, for-profit enterprises. Some of them are nonprofit research groups. But I think I bring the perspective of what does it take to get an organization to actually adopt a visualization. So like in this case, we've all adopted the cone of uncertainty. We didn't really have a choice. It gets beamed to us through the television. We decide if we want to learn it or not. But you know, for an industry that's making a buying decision about something that has a visual element to it, they're going to judge whether they think it works for them. And what I think that's illuminated for me in the many years of trying to sell visualization is that visualization is not one thing. There's visual, I used to make a distinction between explanatory visualizations and exploratory visualizations. I would be a little bit more specific in a sort of use case, which is I think can be a mismatch between the persona who's using a visualization and the nature of the visualization. And so there's what's happening. There's people that want to know what's happening. There's people who want to know what it means. And there's people who want to know what they should do. And it's really valuable to understand how distinct those three things can be. There are people that want to know what to do, but do not care why or what caused it. I mean, maybe that's not fair. Maybe they care, but it's not technically their job. And so I think one of the challenges in sort of bridging, academia to industry or to impact in the world is that if you present, the visualizations that Joanna showed are amazing for being able to understand what's happening. They have so much depth. But if you want to know what to do, if that time series meant you should shut down the line, you need a visualization that's a big red circle or something like that, So I think things get lost through a lack of understanding that a perfectly good tool for one persona might not be a perfectly good tool for a different persona.
Yes, that's a very good question, Chris. Working in an English department, I have colleagues who work on text. And the same thing in medieval studies. So much of the profession has moved forward looking at text and not so much images and visualization. They understand intellectual work connected to text, but intellectual work taking images of manuscripts and analyzing them and trying to capture the materiality, really, it takes some real explaining to try to get somebody to understand what I'm doing, even for tenure and promotion, all those fun things. It gets to be a challenge. The other side of the story is that I built a two-person traveling VR system so I could actually show people in medieval studies the value of having 3D images of illuminated manuscripts. And when you have a new technology, understanding how it's going to help you is nearly impossible unless we start doing it. So one of the things that I found is that scholars, when they saw an illuminated page, especially young scholars, they wanted to fly through it, which was really quite interesting. It was because you can't touch a page. I 3D printed a page, and I was the first speaker, and after everybody spoke and we had questions, my 3D printout hadn't come back around to me. And I had a scholar come up to me afterwards who had the model, and he was running his fingers over it. And he said, I've been going to archives for 30 years wanting to touch the contours of a page and haven't been able to do it. So I think there's some real opportunities until people try them. One of the amazing things that happened to me when I was playing with illuminated manuscript pages in the VR, I can transcribe a page twice as fast on a computer screen because I never lose my place, because I can see the whole page. I can just turn my head side to side. I can have a digital recovery page next to a regular page, and I can go back and forth. And I was using Oculus, and so the hand controllers have a little pointer on them. And if I was ever worried about losing my place, I would just hold the pointer to that place. But the pages are the size of a building in there, and I can see everything very clearly. And I can just speak into a recording system and then do voice recognition. All I do is go through the letters, T, H, E, and before I know it, I've got a page transcribed. So I think those types of benefits are just impossible to even imagine until you try and play. So in many ways, I'm very lucky because I get to play.
Those answers are so great. And one of the perhaps surprising things to me is that each of you touched on technological issues, but they were almost like peripheral to things, right? All of your answers were very human in character, whether it was a matter of, people working with their original data and being able to assert quality and maintenance, and how does that get passed on to others, right? Or adoption kind of like from the institutional or the organizational perspective, or in some ways, Dave, the opposite, right? Kind of like social acceptance and individual personality level acceptance of things. And then say best practices or scholarly practices in the community. So maybe I should actually flip it over a little bit and ask, the issues that you deal with in your respective areas and the way that you approach things, are there social issues, human issues that you somehow fit the technology that you might try to work within? Or do you restrict your design space or the set of techniques or approaches? And if so, do you do that in some sort of at least conscious or systematic way? And maybe are there things that you would like to do that you don't for one sort of technological reason or otherwise?
So I thought of something right away, so you can think while I put this out. But so I think there's some obvious things that maybe come to mind for visualization practitioners, like picking color palettes to take into mind color blindness and things like this. But so I think, yeah, there's a variety of social and human factors when you're designing a visualization. I think one thing I've learned, because I'm interested in networks, I've become increasingly interested in networks, and if you've explored a lot of network visualizations, you figure out pretty quickly how limited they are when they get big. And so you sort of move beyond the network pretty quickly and say, I can get the same sort of information through other techniques. There's adjacency matrix, there's all sorts, and even just algorithmically, I can run network algorithms behind the scenes to produce the same information. What I didn't expect, though, and I think I'm going to talk about networks, I think it applies to other visualizations as well, is that sometimes what people need a visualization for is not to necessarily answer their question, but to feel that the problem they're experiencing is seen. So sometimes creating a really big hairball network, which isn't the solution to anything, but to the manager of a company who is struggling to keep track of all of the different projects, who can't explain to her boss why it's such a hard problem, being able to put down a visualization that just says, this is what I'm dealing with, right? This is why I can't give you an answer in the first 5 minutes. And this happened. One of the early projects we did was with a organization associated with Harvard Medical School. And when they saw the messiness of the network, I was originally apologetic. I'm not anymore, but sort of like, oh, sorry, we're going to do a bunch of techniques to make this better. She was just like, this is great, And so it made me think that just like as visual experts, we might know what's wrong with certain visualizations and why pie charts are not great, or why word clouds, have biases or things like this. But it doesn't mean the person using it is as advanced. And sometimes the best way to get them there is to let them experience it for themselves and have their own learning curve, and use the visualization to accelerate that.
Let me follow up on that, if that's okay. To the last point you just made, that sometimes you can have something that's not even a great visual but can be useful. We have a related concept in weather forecasting. There's a distinction between a forecast that is high quality and that it's accurate and scientifically rigorous and everything, and a forecast that's valuable. And one of the best examples of a forecast that was very poor but actually very valuable to our country was the D-Day invasion. It turns out that the German meteorologists were more advanced than ours. That's not a surprise. A lot of meteorology, synoptic meteorology, comes from Northern Europe and in Germany. And they accurately predicted that the wave heights at the beach in Normandy would be too high for us to land our ships. And so they predicted that we wouldn't do it. Well, our forecast wasn't as good, and we thought we could do it, so we did. Surprise! And that element of surprise was very valuable. So a poor forecast led to a great outcome, and it really depends. So it's all about context. It's all about the context of the user and the messiness of those that situatedness. So when you're asking about the human process that we bring in on the forecast side, I like how you described play. You need to let people play with stuff. I work in a test bed environment where we take prototype technologies and have users come in. And it really is just having them play with it. But because we're serious scientists, we say that we're doing co-production of technology. And we start with the concept, just a messy, something that technology developers can make work. And they're just like, I just need someone to look at this. Tell me if this is even something that you remotely think you could use. And for some of our users in emergency management, in broadcast meteorology, public safety, they have no idea that such a thing could ever have been possible until they start playing with it. And then they start thinking, oh, actually, I could change everything about how I do what I do because I'm able to see the event horizon in a completely different way. So that aspect of play and iteration is really, really important, and that's the biggest thing that we do to foster a breakdown of that bureaucratic, intractability. The more people you can bring on board, the more that you can actually get something transferred. So the transfer of technology, the implementation of technology, especially in the government, is a human process. So you just have to let people play with it, see it, explore it, and they'll get convinced for themselves of the value.
Very good point. I would like to continue with that because in Industry 4.0, we sometimes face a very interesting problem with the end users, which is that they fear to be replaced by some data-driven mechanism. And the more you can convince them that the visualization is really there to help them and that the visualization itself doesn't include any domain knowledge, that the domain knowledge still has to come from them, the more they're not, or they would accept this technology in a way. So like you said, that sometimes it would be enough to just have a red or green light to know should I shut down or not. Yes, I think it would be possible, but on the other hand, to leave this decision to the end users is really an important issue, to not let them feel being replaced by data, which is not possible anyway. But for them, it feels a little bit like that, because before that, the knowledge was just in their head, and now it's in the data, and that's a completely new shift in industry going on currently. And their visualization can help to give them back the feeling that they're still in charge of making decisions.
One thing that I've found really interesting in bringing an illuminated manuscript inside VR is students form relationships to it. If they look at a page on a screen, it's just kind of distance from them. But if they share the space with it, they suddenly will nickname them, which is really interesting. And I must admit, when I see a manuscript in real life and get to go to the archive and turn the pages, I form that relationship too. So one thing that I always think about when I'm kind of thinking about how to visualize or work within that space, and it kind of goes back to something that Dave said earlier, was you spoke about it in a different way. I'll speak about it in kind of just at a little slant, is how we think about things. And I'm always very aware that we have 22 to 33 senses. Something like proprioception, knowing where our body's parts are. When I pick up a manuscript, I know its size in a different way. And so when students are in VR, they get proprioception from where those hand controllers are. So when we're thinking about something, if I can touch it, how much do I think with touch? I have no idea, because it's such an automatic process. And I think that when we start visualizing things differently, and in VR, I just can't wait till the VR gloves come down to a price that I can actually feel a manuscript in VR. But when we start moving our minds in different ways and using different elements of sight and organizing information in our brains differently, how does that help us to think through whether it's problems, whether reassessing what we're doing on the job, or how I'm thinking about this manuscript to have insights that I wouldn't have any other way?
I've been sitting back here listening to your answers, and as a visualization technologist, feeling very humbled. Right, so I asked a question about how might you use more visualization technology in the things that you do, and every one of your answers seemed to boil down to less is more. Right? So let me ask that a little bit deeper. Are there ways in the work that you do to develop and deploy and study the usage of your applications to kind of take that into account? How do you work to identify the core of what it is that your users really need from your various user groups, and then figure out how to integrate that into how you go about things?
It's basically a really human-centered design process, like we would suggest in all cases. It's a procedure of a lot of meetings, a lot of talking to the people, trying to get to know their terms, trying to understand their tasks. And it's really a cumbersome process because I'm a computer scientist and have no idea of manufacturing. So it really takes time until I understand what they are talking about, and they're really deep in their field and they have no clue that someone else would not be able to understand what they are talking about. So it really takes some time. And also when they use the tools, we have a lot of regular meetings where we do some evaluation on what is working well, what should be improved, and so on. So really a lot of iteration, talking to the people, and continuous development, actually. So our tools are never finished in a way. We always explore new tasks and new features they need, and it's continuous development in several directions.
Man, yeah, this has been one of the tough questions for us, because in public safety, technically our users are everyone, and there are a lot of disaster subcultures across the country that we contend with when we're trying to do public safety messaging. On the development side, I'll take one user group, so not just whole public, but looking at just public safety officials and emergency managers. We have some emergency managers, like here in Oklahoma, they're all very, very highly trained, in part because we have organizations here that are, like with the National Weather Center, where I work, hundreds of meteorologists sitting in Norman, Oklahoma, able to train up the hundreds of emergency management officials that exist in the state. But there are people who are in rural Kentucky who are the fire chief, and they just so happen to have the job of doing all of this other stuff. It's their side hustle is the weather piece. This even exists in places like Florida, Texas. If you've ever heard about, really difficult evacuation decision-making that goes on. In Texas, we learned in Harvey, it was the county judge that's making these calls like, what in the world training do you have to do this? And so that's our universe of users. And to engage them, we would bring people into our test bed environment so they could feel out the technologies and do the iteration piece. But we came very quickly to realize the people who are going to volunteer for that stuff are the already weather savvy ones, the tech savvy people who want, oh yeah, every little thing you can give me, I want it all. And what we really need, if we're going to fulfill the public safety mission, are the people who have no resources, no training, and don't know that we exist at all. They don't know what Norman, Oklahoma is to meteorology. Like, this is one of our meccas, right? A lot of EMs are like, I've got to get to Norman. Oh my gosh, the weather. And I want the people who have no idea that we exist. That is a very difficult engagement to do. And we're trying to improve that by being inclusive in hiring. We hired an emergency manager onto my team who has the personal relationships necessary to network into those places where meteorologists have not saturated, or we haven't gotten. And we're doing the same for our broadcast partners. We've hired people who come from broadcast companies who understand that it's the director of a station that makes all the decisions and not just the meteorologist. So we really have to engage the people who are creating the systems they use, the people who are managing them. Those are the people we have to engage and convince. So, just really trying to expand our idea of engagement is going to give us a better footprint for public safety, and it's going to just be this ever-expansive process.
I think that maybe for those of us that are drawn to visualization, just seeing like a really data dense, rich, illuminating visualization is like satisfying in itself. You know, it has like its own little dopamine hit, and it's easy to think that other people will have a similar dopamine hit, you know, when they experience that visualization. But, you know, a lot of people don't care about the visualization. It's a means to an end. And so I think what I'd say is that the getting feedback, I think, like getting honest feedback and sort of co-production with the users, I think requires remembering that they're trying to do something. I mean, most of us book plane flights through something like Orbitz or Kayak. It's a pretty amazing data application. There's lots of different visualizations, little matrix coming back a day earlier, a day later, there's filters. There's way more sophisticated visualizations you could do, like networks of the route map, but no one actually wants to use that to book a plane flight, right? So I think understanding when you're thinking about what you're showing, just staying connected to what action, like at the end of the day, so they're gonna metaphorically book a ticket. You know, what ticket are they booking? And are all of the things that you're doing, you know, getting to them to that goal? The last thing I'd say on that is that friction in you, like creating some friction, not necessarily in the interface, but barriers is actually one of the best ways to get honest feedback. So if you give, I mean, this is built into, you know, my business, because I'm in business, so there's a price tag, and that's a form of friction. So if it's not adding value, people are not gonna buy it. And, you know, depending on the environments in which you work, that might not be the form of friction that you apply, but don't think that your job is to remove all friction necessarily, because if you create some friction in the interaction, that is sort of what forces the user, if they're willing to overcome that friction, then you know that you're adding value through your technique. If there is no friction, by and large, most people, unless they've been like trained in art school, do not like to give negative feedback. They don't like to say no. They don't like to say a visualization's bad. They don't like to say that you're being unhelpful or you're wasting their time. Like, people would rather say nice things. And so the way to get the honest feedback is to actually create a little friction where they sort of have to put their money where their mouth is, so to speak.
Well, after hearing those answers, I have it easy because I'm using my VR and my visualizations for teaching and for research. And when I built the traveling VR workstation, I took it to conferences, and they allowed me, usually I would give a talk, and then I'd set up at lunch hour, and usually for about 2 hours, and people would come and try it out. And people were curious enough that I always had more people who wanted to try it out than we even had time for. And I even developed a little survey, but I preferred to talk with people. And I could usually talk with somebody as the next person was trying it. And at first I was leading people through it, but then I thought, nah, I'm just gonna have them put the headsets on, tell them how to use the controllers and let them go. And to see if they could figure out the annotation tool, how to change the lighting, how to measure something. And I was very happy when people figured that out. And then I could have conversations as far as other tools that they might want or what was awkward about the situation. When I'm teaching, I can just ask the students, and usually we have conversations. Students, on the whole, because it's such a new technology, they're really excited to engage with it. And when students start talking excitedly about something, the things that they don't like come out immediately. You know right away. So I'm very lucky.
Very lucky to get accosted with feedback.
Yes.
But by the way, if anyone in the audience has a question, feel free to raise your hand or put your question on Slido. There is still a technical question on Slido that I will get to at some point. I have another big question, but we'll come back to that.
Hello, I'm Philip. Thank you all for making this nice panel. I have a question that I also experienced by myself. So when you ship such a visualization or a tool or some sort of framework to your customer, say a company that purchased the thing, and then they throw this thing at the workers that should really use the visualization, what amount of training do you expect to get these workers ongoing, and how do you solve this problem? And especially, how much training do you sell additionally to your tool for that? Okay, thank you.
Just start, and we have another order, not always the same.
We'll start to randomize it. Yeah, we'll start to randomize it. You ask a question that is really important for us. I know it's not a business, but when our publics come to our graphics, our visualizations, we can't assume they have any training. In fact, in public safety, you're told to communicate at like the 5th grade word level. We can't even, we're thinking about, can we use the word uncertainty and really have anyone even understand what that means? Especially, I mean, the people who are disproportionately affected by disasters are less literate, they're poor, they're less well-resourced. We can't have any expectation of training of any kind. So when we are, developing with that in mind, it's very important for us to think about the visual we're making. Can people make natural inferences about what that is and what that means? And when we do our testing, if we do experiments like decision experiments with generalizable samples of the US population, when we focus on breaking that down by demographic groups, do we see differences, or is it fairly even across different groups? We want something that's more fair to promote an environmental justice perspective, right, in our work. So that's really our big thing, is trying to focus on the vulnerable populations that are more likely to be affected. How do they understand the hazard? I'll make a really concrete example really quickly and pass this off. Everyone in this room has probably heard a meteorologist give the probability of precipitation for the day. If I was to poll you all in this room, there would probably be as many different definitions of what that actually means as there are people. It turns out that's also true for meteorologists. Meteorologists don't agree about what that's supposed to mean. Is it the fraction of the day that it's raining? Is it going to rain over a certain part of the space? Is it going, the definition actually is on 50% of the days like today, it rained. It's climatology based. No one knows that. No one wants that. We don't even want that. I mean, the reason we make it is because it's very convenient for us to do our little statistics, right? We can make this stat like that, but it's useless. And that's what the hurricane cone of uncertainty is too, by the way. It's how good were we at forecasting over the last 5 years? What's the 66% of the track error over the last 5 years? You could have a hurricane that could go completely east or west, but we know it's one of the two. But forecasters have to draw a line one way and draw this little cone around it, and we hide the entire story. So what's wrong is the reference class of information isn't in line with the decisions people need to make. We make it out of convenience. So I'm really trying to help our field shift from that toward this helping people and meeting people where they are. Who wants to be our random next?
So, I've spent a lot of time thinking about training in the last couple of years in particular, and thinking about that people really don't want to do it. So I've come to the belief that actually, like, the way people learn to play video games is the way people kind of want to learn to do everything, which is really, they want to do it. They want to do, I don't know, how did you ride a bike? You didn't like read a book about riding a bike, you got on and you fell off and hopefully didn't hurt yourself too much and you just kept trying. And so I think it's interesting to think about how to take the tools that we're developing and create this kind of video game training. I mean, I guess it's not limited to video games, this sort of experiential learning component to it. Practically, what I've found that means, you guys may come to different conclusions. If you do, I'd love to hear about it because I think it's a hard problem. But one of the conclusions I've come to is that when we have a visualization that we know works or a tool that we know works, part of the reason we know it works or believe it works is because we put some complex data set in and we found a complex answer. It can be valuable to sort of go down a few levels and create a synthetic data set that's way simpler and like it's a puzzle. Like think about Wordle. People love playing Wordle, right? So if you really simplify the data set and you say, and you make it clear to people, okay, this is not your data, but this is in some way indicative of one aspect of the phenomenon you care about, and now it's in the visualization, can you find the answer? And I think that, like you were pointing out, sure, it's great if you can we'd love to make visualizations that people can just intuit when they look at it. There's a tension there, because in the act of doing that, you run the risk of sort of oversimplifying certain aspects. So you can go that direction. If you make something simple enough, you don't need a lot of training, and sometimes that's entirely the right call. But if you come to the conclusion that there's just so much nuance in the phenomenon that it needs a somewhat complex tool, then I think you simplify the data and you give people a very clear call to action in a way that they feel reward. They get, again, this sort of dopamine hit, right? They get some like immediate satisfaction that they found it, and then think about how you work that up until they're actually looking at their complex data.
This is a little out of my range, but in working with the VR system, menu items, having them very clean and simple, common terms, the shorter the word, the better, as long as it's descriptive of what you want it to do. So, we started out with like measurement tool, which became measurement. And that was a simple verb, measure. And then we just kind of worked from there, all simple verbs, and have it very easily accessible, not make menu items go down very far. Just we try to keep them no more than one level in. That's probably pretty standard practice for everybody.
One more thing to add on this, actually, I started thinking about that. Like in my company, at one point, we focused on documentation, and then we came to this conclusion that no one really wants documentation. So then we focused on, like, there is no document, let's just improve the UX, which is actually, I think, what most people like. But there is this interesting subtlety. There were a lot of people that won't read the documentation, but won't feel comfortable unless they know it's there. It's a safety net. And to be fair, they might go and refer to it. Like if they go and they try the video game and they get stuck, they'd like to know that they can go into a wiki or a help desk or watch a video or something and they can get the answer. So I sort of forgot that, but it's like, I think it's easy, there's this, the acronym like RTFM, you guys all know what that stands for? Like, read the friggin' manual. Like it's an acronym because people don't. It's easy to then think that it has no value. I think that's not exactly true. There, like the learning the bike example, maybe your parents, convinced you to go try without training wheels, but you probably wouldn't have done it if they weren't running alongside. And for certain people, not everybody, but for certain people, and I think it's a non-trivial number, some documentation, some training, like a Thinkific course or something, even if they don't enroll in it, it makes them feel like someone's running alongside them. The documentation is running alongside them as they try the bike. And if they can just pedal without it, then great. But sometimes they're not willing to try unless they know it's there.
I'll add a really quick note and pass it along. But following on from that, another thing that we can do, because you're right, we can't just always leave it at the most naturally inferable, graphic that could be an oversimplification. It could miss a lot of things we want to say. Another option to follow your get people hooked and then keep them going is we can try to facilitate drill down. So instead of focusing on training, like you need to know how to do this, you can do a user experience, design that helps them, okay, here's the first piece of information, and then they follow a path through additional layers that is inferable itself. Like they understand how to go through the path to figure out what they need to figure out.
So the answer to the question in our case, how much guidance is needed and how much training, the short answer is a lot. The effort is tremendous, and otherwise it's not possible to get the users use the tool. So we spend a lot of time doing trainings, walking them through analysis, and we are in a very lucky situation. We have one company partner where we really have power users sitting there who do the training for other people in a company. That's really great, and we're really lucky on that. But for all the others, it's a lot of effort. It is, and I think there's no way to get around of that as long as the tools are very complex.
I will have a wrap-up question in a second because we only have a few more minutes, but I do want to sneak in the Slido question, which is for Bill. It's a little bit more on the specific side. The comment from Anonymous is, incredibly fascinating approach to analyzing these manuscripts. Are there ways to visualize the artifacts that you find in these texts? Beyond the 3D view, can we make a catalog of artifacts?
Yes, we can. And that's a huge question. Somebody just actually started putting together, or actually finished the first volume or 2 volumes of an index of iconology of manuscripts made in England. And now there's a lot of discussion going on in the field. Is it ethical just to print it versus putting it online where people can explore the data? And so I think when we start thinking about how to reference these pages, how do we want to go about doing it? We need to almost invent terminology for it. Visualizations seem to be, I think, a more powerful way of doing it, to connect manuscripts and features through relationships of some sort. I think would be a much more intuitive and a helpful way of doing it, because if imagery has aspects to it that are related, there's a good chance that those monasteries were related, or they had access to a exemplar that they were using, and suddenly we can connect and see things. In text, it's very easy, because when you're copying a text, if there's an odd word, and then a manuscript 20 years later has that same odd word in it, you know that there's a relationship between the two. And I think we'd find the same thing with imagery. One thing I'm actually kind of working on, I've been learning Python. And so what I want to do is do a visualization of the page, not by how it looks, but by color. So I know how much pigment and different color is in a page. So it'll be kind of like a weird, I'm not even sure what it'll look like because I haven't done it yet, maybe a bar chart or a kind of a continuation of different various shades. But that would give me good information about how much parchment is on a page, how much ink is on a page. So I think when we start thinking about how we might visualize and catalog these pages, there are things that I'm sure that would be wonderfully helpful that nobody's imagined yet. And I think visualization and actually talking to people who are working in other fields, I think you're far ahead of us in medieval studies with this. So I'm going to keep looking at your work and borrowing some ideas on how you're visualizing things, and it will probably spark ideas of things we can do ourselves.
So we're at time. I hope you don't mind if we go about 5 more minutes or so, since we started a little bit late. First off, is there any burning quick question from anyone in the audience? Yeah. I have one big... Okay. Would you like to ask it or not? Okay, cool.
But my life won't change.
You never know.
Yeah. I think as well, maybe this question fitted better in the morning session, but then I attended something else, so I will try my luck here. So the question is, how should a research group make a visualization tool that they deem valuable more accessible? Because I value making accessibility or having a societal impact a lot. But often for research groups, this implies non-traditional, non-research efforts. And for smaller research groups, they either don't have the money or time to do this. So yeah, that was my question.
I think the most important point is to make it accessible somehow as an open source service. So that's, I think, the the best way to make other people use the tool, to have a demo running, to have some open source version, because that's something we face with our industry partners, that if tools cannot be integrated into their workflows, they're not going to use it. So if the tool is somehow available, has clear defined interfaces, clear defined input strategies for data, then there's a way that people will use it. Shall I put it back? Mm-hmm.
To respond to your comments, I totally agree with that. But as you also said, having a tool requires continuous development, improvements, and it's mainly those efforts who are taking most of the time and money afterwards. Making it accessible via open source is a one-time effort, but making it durable and sustainable in longitudinal period is a thing that is sometimes too cumbersome for most research instances. And then those tools tend to degrade in quality or usage over time.
I totally agree. I mean, research groups slowly start to have something like research engineers who do this work. And I think that's a way to go. But we are struggling in the same direction. So we are always on the border between just development or research, and development is usually the larger part. And I actually don't have a good answer to that, unfortunately, because I'm also struggling along this way and also trying to not put too much development in it. So I think one way to go is to have like research engineers who are really just there for the deployment, basically. But maybe you have different.
I just found myself curious. I mean, the term accessibility sort of has two meanings. And so one is sort of accessible to a widely accessible. It's increasingly become used in terms of making tools that work for those that are deaf or blind, or, sort of spending the time to encode alt captions in images and in a visualization. I've actually seen there's some tremendous work done by Vint Cerf, who's the chief evangelist at Google, around accessible visualization. So you can hover over a scatter plot, for example. If you're blind, you hover over it, and the sort of alt tags will tell you what's happening. This is monotonically increasing or things like that. That's a lot of work, which I think is part of the question. That's a lot of work, and I think the only way for groups to get to the point where that type of work gets prioritized is actually if we have more diverse people working on it. If our research groups and our engineers, if we have, I had a colorblind engineer on my team, and that really changed the way that we prioritized color blindness. And so I think the more diversity we put into the research environment, of course you can mandate it, but the more diversity we put into the research environment, the more naturally I think the prioritization will become to recognize that those people need to be able to use the tool.
Okay, so one last big question, right? We've been talking here about all sorts of things like understand your users, less is more, keep it simple, stupid. Users will do surprising things, meet them on their level, right? Given that the topic of this panel is bridging academia, industry, and government, right? Do you have any pearls of wisdom of what to do or not to do for each other based on what you've heard today? I told you to be on the spot.
Well, sometimes I would really love the academics to more listen to the people working in application-oriented projects. So what are the real problems that we are working on, so that we really have data problems and similar stuff, and not developing another fancy visualization. So I think bridging this gap, we have a very good channel from university to industry. We're really good in that, but to have this feedback loop closing, it would be really great if we would have get more response from academia listening to our problems. That would be really great.
Yeah, I try, from the government perspective, we're trying to sell that we have a very interesting use case for academics to come in and play. And we recognize that, like you were just describing, we're not necessarily working in a theoretical space that you're going to get rewarded for in one aspect of your work, but we are attached to a federal agency that can get funding because of its mission, and we have research funding that comes in to support it, and that can be a hook. With the private sector, in meteorology, we have a really interesting, almost contentious relationship often between the government and private sector companies. And the way that we're working to resolve it in our research institution is just by involving everybody in every stage of development, because ultimately we also recognize that no matter what the government decides to do in visualization, ultimately everything that people receive is delivered through private sector outfits. So it's almost fully mediated messaging. And so it's in our best interest to work with the private sector to be sure that we develop something that's both operationally implementable and something that they will work with their systems. Otherwise, it's not going to get to anyone at the end of the day.
I think that one of the challenges of being part of a capitalistic society is that it's easy for the industrial perspective, which is kind of the money-making perspective, to be the tail that wags the dog. And so, I worry a little bit. I don't think the message necessarily is, always less is more and sort of dumb it down for the users. We also need to bring them forward. So, we need to bring them forward into more complex analyses, into different types of tools, into different types of literacy. So I guess my sense of what can be done for each other between industry, academia, and government is, I think that, I see this with like the humanities versus STEM. We put a big emphasis on like the practical knowledge. I married a humanist, so it's like, I think what we need in academia is wonderfully complex, new, out-of-the-box, innovative things, and not to be too worried necessarily about how that's gonna get distilled down, initially, not to be too worried about how it gets distilled down, but then to work, to have partnership with industry to say, okay, now how do we take this thing and sort of break it apart into some pieces that can be gamified and trained. I think that the government sits in an interesting position of, like, I feel like no one knows better than the government that presenting the data is not the same as getting people to act on it. I mean, we just went through this pandemic and vaccine hesitancy. I mean, there's a tremendous policy aspect of action, and my parents live in Miami. My dad did not evacuate, with Hurricane Ian. So, like, I think the government can offer this policy lens around what it actually takes for people, for behavior change based on data. And academics can offer sort of a new vision of what could be if people were willing to get outside of their comfort zone. I think what industry needs to offer is money to, not just to the profits of the industry, but back to the ecosystem of research and policy making and social interaction, so that those three things are symbiotic instead of one-way streets.
Yeah, and I'll get right back to the money. Continuing on that, the humanities do not get large grants on the whole unless you partner with somebody in the sciences, and then the science is normally driving the grant. And recently, multispectral imaging systems are very expensive, so the NEH funded Rochester Institute of Technology, David Messenger, to actually design a low-cost multispectral imaging system that costs about $7,000, and I've got some money, and we're going to try to build it in the electrical and computer engineering. It would be great if there are ways to cultivate those relationships with business more. I think that many people in the humanities have data sets that are going to be connected to the types of analysis and work that you want algorithms or your visualizations to work on. And if we could partner those data sets with people in business who can develop something, the software will drive the money. the humanists can keep their data, and some of it's protected, so we have to be careful with it, especially if it's human subjects. But that way we would develop tools for academics. At the same time, we're developing tools for people, and we get the corporate working in it. Now, it may take government to step in to help us kind of share those data sets in some ways, but I'd love to figure out a way where we could, make very evident to anybody who's working on a project the data sets that the people in the humanities have, that they could work with somebody in industry to develop applications to move both of our worlds forward.
Okay, excellent. I mean, thank you so much. I mean, this is exactly what I hope to have from panels, basically concentrated sharing of experience and wisdom, especially on the practical side, which is important for us. So please, everybody, join me in thanking our 4 panelists. Great.